So we'll be finishing off the day with programming aspects, and I think we've really covered very nicely today how to implant and how to recognize different types of capture, the rationale behind it. But programming is just as important as implanting. So if you do a great implant and you don't program your device properly, the patient won't get the benefit from the device you've implanted and may be even at risk for adverse events if you don't do that properly. We know that with HIS bundle pacing because it can be tricky, and the devices that we have today are not really designed for HIS bundle pacing. So there are some nice tips and tricks on the Medtronic Academy site for HIS bundle pacing is when the HIS bundle lead is connected to the right ventricular port. This other one with this review paper, which we put together with members of the faculty, it's a very detailed paper. Don't expect to understand and memorize everything in there, but I think it can serve you as a reference guide how to program and to get things right. So would recommend you reading it. So let's just have a look at the different configurations. Now, you can have a single chamber device, VVI, with a patient in AFib, and the lead is, you can't see that very well, but there's a HIS lead just there. You can have a dual chamber typically in a patient with AV block, an atrial lead and a HIS lead. So there's different possibilities on how to set up the system, but it's basically going to boil down to three factors. Number one, what's the aim of HIS bundle pacing? Is it in lieu of RV pacing? The next thing is whether the patient's in sinus rhythm or an AFib. Obviously, if he's in sinus rhythm, you need to have an atrial lead there. So you have different configurations. The disadvantage is that you have lower impedance and you will get a high current drain. And if your threshold is already a little bit high and you have to ramp up the output, then that could really compromise the longevity. And it's not always available. And then you have bipolar, which gives you the best impedances, the highest impedances, but may have somewhat higher capture thresholds. And the problem with the bipolar is this. This is a patient who has HIS bundle pacing and who's got complete AV block after AV nodal ablation. And if you look at this, or if your referring physician looks at this, he probably thinks that for some reason the conduction has recurred. But then if you look very carefully, there's actually a tiny pacing spike there. So this patient is actually having HIS bundle pacing, but that may not be apparent to everybody. Now, another thing that one has to bear in mind is the delays. Where the HIS is plugged into the right ventricular port. In many ways, it's just as you would program a conventional device. In this instance, if the patient's obviously in AFib, then you program in VVIR. If you have sensing issues, you can program higher sensitivity, lower values. If the patient is in sinus rhythms, you have a right atrial lead plus a HIS, then you can, if you want to spare pacing or HIS pacing, say the patient has sick sinus syndrome, you can for sure program a mode such as AAI, DDI, or an MVP mode. That's possible. The problem with this, the big problem, is the sensing issues, because very often the R wave is small, especially if you have selective HIS capture, then it can really be even below 1 millivolt. So you can run into ventricular undersensing, and you run into atrial or HIS potential oversensing. So that's something you have to be very careful when you're doing the implant. This is an example in a patient in whom I had implanted the dual chamber pacemaker for AV block with malaise, and he came back with recurrent symptoms. And this is what we saw on the surface ECG, non-selective capture, and here the QRS changes, and this is actually intrinsic. You can see P waves. So if you look at the electrogram, this is what we see. Now, the HIS sensitivity was set at 0.6 millivolts because this sensing. So the R wave was actually sensed at 0.8 millivolts. So that gave a very small margin. AS, VS, AS, VS. This is the HIS lead here. And what do we see here? We see atrial potential. So basically, the HIS lead connected to the right ventricular port is oversensing the far field atrium. It's actually not that far field, it's pretty near field, and preventing a delivery of pacing, and the patient has symptoms with that. Now, this is a very tricky question on how to solve this, and this is why I won't go I won't ask you to reply because the R-wave sensing was 0.8 millivolts. But the device is actually sensing the smallest signal, and that's the one it's giving you. So the way around this is to program the sensitivity at 1.2 millivolts and redo your sensing test. And lo and behold, your R-wave now, which is the true R-wave, is being sensed at 2.3 millivolts. So what was 0.8 was actually the far-field P-wave. Okay? So the way around this is to program a sensitivity. We programmed at 1.2 millivolts and got rid of the problem. An alternative would be to program sensing in unipolar. And in that case, it's just a screw to the can. And you're taking away the ring electrode, which is closer to the atrium, and picking up those atrial signals. And notice that with unipolar sensing, the atrial electrograms are much smaller. But I still prefer to, in this instance here, this patient to program it with bipolar because less risk of my potential oversensing and so forth. So that's just one example. Another thing is the AV interval, because you have to discount the latency that comes out with the pacing spike to the QRS interval, which basically corresponds to the HV interval. So you need to program shorter AV intervals to obtain the true physiological AV interval you wish to obtain. And let me just show you this example. This was a lady who had painful left bundle branch block. Now, I don't know if any of you have had this. We see this from time to time. It's a very strange syndrome where the moment a patient has a left bundle branch block, usually rate-dependent, they have intense chest pain from one beat to the next. So extremely invalidating. And in this patient, I had implanted his bundle pacing with a very good initial response. A few other case reports out there which show this indication. But then she came back with recurrent pain. So I did a stress test. And this is during a slow rhythm, narrow QRS, and as soon as she's about 90 beats per minute, the left bundle branch pattern comes in, and it's very painful. So the out-of-the-box setting for the AV interval, the sensed AV, was 100 milliseconds. And in fact, if you look at the QRS here, this is narrow QRS, this is left bundle branch block, and with the sensed AV at 100, we have a fusion. So the QRS looks narrow, but in fact, it's different compared to the intrinsic QRS. And what we want is to have something which resembles the intrinsic QRS during narrow QRS, because that's where it's not painful. And the way to obtain that was with non-selective capture, but with a much shorter AV interval to 60 milliseconds. And just by shortening the AV interval, the sensed AV interval, to 60 milliseconds, the patient was completely asymptomatic again. Won't go too much into the ventricular capture management, but if you can connect your HIS lead to the RV port, the RVCM may work. It may work, but it's going to give you either the myocardial or the HIS if it's selective. But again, it may not. It can give you erroneous thresholds, be they too low or too high. So you can't rely really upon this in all patients. You can leave it on monitor. There's no harm there. But I would be a bit cautious about using this as in the automatic setting. What we would like is to have a device. You tell the device, my channel actually has a HIS lead into it. And automatically, it's going to set the refractory periods and all that as per the requirements. We don't have that now. I sincerely hope that this is going to happen so that we can really facilitate the programming, because right now, it's a little bit like this. Thank you for your attention.